everyone. In this class, I want to get everyone thinking about what a city is in just a very general way. So I thought we could start with actually very simple groupings of population to help us think about what a city fundamentally is. So we're going to talk about some key features of cities for a little bit, and then we're going to look at a painting of a village in present-day North Dakota for some clues about urban organization. Okay, so I think the most important thing to realize about a city is that it is a sort of prime location in some way. There is a particularly favored spot that is going to become a city. And if you think about it, this is probably something that you've memorized for world history, but I'd like you almost to come at it by thinking about some of the large cities that have developed on the planet, and you'll notice that they share a common feature. So this is a map of Rome. This is a map of part of Shanghai. This is a map of the Loop in Chicago. And I'm sure you're picking up on the commonality between these slides. But they all have proximity to water, and they often have proximity to more than one body of water. So the presence of water is very important for the siting of a city. And this has all kinds of practical reasons. It's a source of fresh water, and it's also a source of sanitation. And that is incredibly important in cities. You'll probably be shocked to know that even today, a lot of cities actually discharge sewage into local rivers. They don't do it on purpose, but when the storm sewers become overloaded, the storm sewers are often tied in to the brownwater sewers, and that can become a problem in heavy rain events. So actually improving the waterways and reducing the use of our waterways as sort of sanitary overflow sewers is actually a really important health goal, even in the developed world in the 21st century. The other thing that happens, though, on the water is not just all of the meeting the daily needs for fresh water, for cooking, for bathing, for all those sort of personal uses, but water is also the way that places communicate with each other in the pre-fossil fuel era. So having a good position on a river or with connections to other bodies of water allows not only local industries like fishing, but transport between places. And this, may start with small local trading networks, but even in the prehistoric world, we have ample evidence of long distance regional trade that takes place across rivers. So they're very important for the development of commerce. And of course, today we use them for international commerce all the time. But that was true even in very early societies. We have archaeological evidence, for example, of certain kinds of valued goods that come from a distinctive region showing up hundreds of miles away across regional trading networks that are enabled by rivers. So all of these things make rivers really important. And there are certain kinds of favored spots along rivers that seem to almost function as collection sites for human beings. They draw in population and they enable population to grow. Now, of course, that's not going to be possible without some kind of food supply. So you're going to see the increasing development of agriculture in the areas immediately around cities. When you look at early Neolithic times, you see that pattern. And that remains important even today, right? So having food supply that can be brought into the city. The other thing is that one thing that happens in these population centers is that because they are important for trade, these are sites that collect wealth. So they not only collect population, but they collect resources. And as a result, they're vulnerable to attack from outsiders. So you often see cities not only finding a spot that is on a river, but you see them finding a spot where there's some sort of natural barrier that can be used to protect the city. So I'm showing you here a satellite photo of the city of Beijing. You can see it's extensively ringed by mountains, and that darker gray spot is what is sort of the center, the densest center of Beijing. Beijing, by the way, is unusual in being a city that is not on a river. That is one of the reasons they supervise the digging of the Grand Canal in earlier times to facilitate transport of goods. And of course, that is also an area that is known for having built additional fortifications in the form of the Great Wall, wherever the natural mountain barrier needed further enhancement. This pattern also holds true in Europe. I'm thinking of the example of the city of Edinburgh is up on a very steep hill. The oldest part is sort of a castle fortress on a very steep hill, and the city sort of cascades down the hill from there. This old print showing the city of Nuremberg has a similar layout, a hilltop where the oldest fortress was, where the oldest churches are, and then you see the pattern of other buildings coming down the hill, and of course the outer fortification. So if you can see this exterior wall that is running around the city to protect all, not only the inhabitants, but all the treasure inside, all the good stuff that is there. The city of Vienna is something that we're going to be talking about in the next lecture. So here I just thought I would mention what Vienna looks like during the medieval period. You can actually see here the ramparts of the old fortress around the city. So protecting the political dynasty within. All right, so I guess the argument I'm trying to put forward here is that in a way you can think of geography as something that is almost to an extent dictating where cities are going to arise. There's going to be certain combinations, favorable combinations of elements in certain places, and you could expect to see a city in these places. And then you will expect to see population grow and develop there because that region is so well supplied with certain features that are going to be important for life. Okay, so I just wanted to give us a visual example because I think it's really important to realize that cities in this very early idea of the creation of settlements that we're talking about, they don't have to be planned by someone who is sitting at a drafting table with graph paper and an engineering degree in order to have a very strong sense of organization. So if you think about the way cities grow, they tend to have a distinctive pattern, and that pattern may be culturally variable. I chose this example because actually it's sort of unlike European urbanism. So you're looking here at a painting made by the artist George Catlin, who traveled up the Missouri River on actually the first steamboat that went up the Missouri. Catlin was on it, and he made many paintings of the things that he saw. He tended to title his paintings by the mileage above St. Louis that they were. So at this point, he is in what is the present day North Dakota. And he's showing us a view upriver, and you can see that there is a settlement clustered on that bluff that's ahead. So what I thought we could do, and I also just wanted to point out the Mandan village, which is really the focus of what Catlin is painting here, is right on the bluff. And in 1830, so just a couple years before Catlin came to this area, a company called the American Fur Trading Company built a little fort, sort of trading post area, and they sited it right next to the Mandan village, which was their key trading partners for purchasing fur in this area. And fur, of course, was a flourishing 19th century trade in the western part of the United States. So you can see that these two settlements are next to each other, and you can actually see that they're significantly different architecturally and in terms of how they're laid out. So we're not really going to talk about about Fort Clark, but I just wanted to mention that it was there because, of course, here you could almost overlook it, right? It's so tiny. Catlin is showing us what this settlement looks like from a distance. But Catlin was actually really fascinated by the architecture of the Mandan and also the Hidatsa people, who also built in a similar style in this region. And he actually created a painting that was a sort of detailed view of this same village. Both of these now are in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where you can see them. So if we were doing this together in class, what I would probably do right now is pause for a moment and have us just start to identify some of the features of what we see here. So I know it's a little corny, but my suggestion would be to just pause here and write yourself a few notes about what you see in this picture. And of course, there's a wealth of detail that Catlin is packing into this picture, but for our purposes, let's really just try to look at the architecture. Where is it? What is it? How is it organized? Okay, so pause here, give yourself a second to jot down a few notes about that. Okay, so I'm hoping, here I've pulled us in quite a bit closer so we can get sort of a better look at what is happening here. some of the features I would hope you would notice would be the position on a body of water on the Missouri River. That is sort of barely visible right now in this slide to the right, but you remember in that distant view, we could see that this village is actually pushed out on a bluff with a very commanding position overlooking the water. So that actually is a nice site. It's the kind of site that is often favored for a settlement, right? Because it is on the water, but it also has a defensive purpose in that it's not going to be very easy to reach it from the water side up that very steep bluff. You can also see in the distance here that this area is ringed by hills. So that creates a little bit of a barrier and allows you to know if anyone's coming. It gives you a little bit of warning time if anyone is coming to bother you. You can also see ringing the outside of this settlement. If you look, there is a palisade fence. So there is a sort of a spiky, let me see if I can get my controls to show up here. How do I do that? All right, I don't know. Sorry guys, but I don't know if you can see this, but this is the palisade fence all around the edges, right? So that suggests some attention to defense, right, in this area, which suggests that this community has something to lose, right? It is a prosperous community. It does not want to be attacked or robbed. You can also see some characteristic architecture here, right? So these round earthen lodges were very interesting to Catlin. As I say, he painted them many times, including in this painting. And you can see not too much about how those structures are built, but you see that they're roughly circular in form. And you also see that they're clustered in a sort of radiating circular pattern with a common space left in the middle, which people are using for play and exercise and conversation. So what we have is something that appears to be separated dwellings, some possibility of separation, privacy, but also a communal area that is left open in the middle. And you can also see some signs of hierarchy in this village. So you'll notice that some of these dwellings have spirit poles that are coming up out of them or next to them. And that seems to indicate some kind of special quality in some of these dwellings that is absent from other of these dwellings. And particularly, you're noticing that he's sort of focusing in the foreground here on an area that has a number of spirit poles. So this suggests that perhaps these are military leaders, spiritual leaders, people who are special in some way that have this favored position kind of right in front and center in this village. And that leads me to my next point, which is that over time, cities are going to develop more and more specialized people, specialized services, specialized skills. And so they become very exciting spaces because they have a lot of differentiation and structure within them. And that can grow up over time. And Boston is a really good example of this kind of growth because it isn't really planned. There are some cities in colonial America. Many cities in Connecticut actually have town plans that are gridded out from the start, and sort of developed in a very systematic way. Boston doesn't really grow that way. It grows more organically. So it's a good example of organic growth. All right, so this is actually a very famous engraving that was made by Paul Revere in 1768, showing the arrival of a British occupying force to the city. So these ships that are massed in the foreground are actually British ships. And if you see this long wharf that is sticking out on the left side, that actually is called Long Wharf. That is, at this point, that is sort of a commercial hub of Boston, but at this point it's being used to unload this occupying force, and those little red spots are the red-coated British troops who are arriving. The reason why I wanted to start with this view is I think this really expresses Boston's orientation toward the Atlantic Ocean, right? So Revere is actually taking up a position that's sort of hovering above the city, but from the bay, and looking at back at the land. And you can see that there is sort of a tight ribbon of buildings, and then you can actually see green fields and hills in the background. This is very much what colonial Boston was like. It was a city oriented toward commerce with England. So what is built up, what is receiving the majority of attention here is the wharves for loading and unloading of goods back and forth from the mother country of England. And the urbanism doesn't go that deep, right? You can see there's sort of a shallow ribbon along the coast here that describes the built up portion of Boston. This map of Boston is actually from 1722, so a little bit earlier. And I just want to show you a couple of key features. I think you can see the importance of the wharves in this map as well. I'm going to go to the next slide, which just brings us a little bit closer. And I'm going to show you how this pattern, which I've written out here, is visible in this map. Okay, so if you start from the bottom edge, again, you see the letters that say harbor down here on the lower right, and you see these ships sailing around. Okay, so this is the traffic back and forth with England. And you can see that these ships are coming into the harbor, and all along the edge of the harbor, you see these protruding rectangles. These are the wharves for loading and unloading of ships. Long Wharf, Clark's Wharf, these are even really huge wharves where multiple ships can dock and unload on either side. And they also have warehouses running down the center of them so that goods can be stored right on site and then transported to other ships. So this is a sort of hub of commercial activity. It is the most important aspect of what this town is doing commercially. And essentially what you have is this primary sort of commercial space all along the waterfront. And what that creates is then these secondary districts behind it. So if you start to look a little bit inland, which is up on this, behind the wharves, you start to see the layout of streets. And these streets are kind of irregular, right? They're not laid out in straight lines. It's not a grid. It sort of actually follows the shape of the land and the shape of the commercial district, right? That's really what's primary here. And what's growing up behind that is more commercial spaces, more warehouses to store these goods, but also spaces to buy and sell goods, and also residences for the people who are engaged in this trade, right? Because this is an early city. The most desirable living spaces are right next to work because you don't want to have to walk too far. So what you have is a pattern where people with money are actually building residences very, very close to their workspaces. And people who have less money are going to have to live farther away and walk further. You also see something that is public land that is set aside for common uses. So the Boston Common is not a park. So again, I'm not talking about what the Boston Common is today or how it is used today. But I think it's really important to realize historically that this land was set apart for common uses. So what those uses were schooling for children, the storage of arms and powder and areas for militias to drill, so like military training and preparation. This is also set aside for meeting houses. It's also used to graze some cattle in the early days. It is also used for other common purposes like burial. People also use this to set up markets. It is a place where public punishments can be enacted. And unfortunately, it's also a place where people dump their junk. So it's not similar really to what we think of as a park today. It is set aside for common purposes, but those purposes are all functional. They don't really have to do with leisure in a modern sense. There are activities that take place in this area that are important, and those uses are set aside. So when we talk in the next lecture about the development of Boston, you'll see that this common actually becomes part of the modern system of public parks, but that's not till the 19th century. So in the 17th and 18th century, the Boston Common has a very different set of uses. Okay, so one of the things that's going to happen as a result of this trade, trade was not taking place under incredibly favorable terms in Boston. This is a major driver of the American Revolution, is that merchants didn't like the deal that they had, and they wanted more opportunity for amassing wealth. But there was enough wealth in the city that population was growing, becoming more dense, and what happens is that structure starts to fill in. So you start to have people who are making things to sell in the local market. So, for example, in Boston, you would have blacksmiths making tools. You would have coopers making the barrels that things would be transported in. You would have all of these kinds of local businesses. You would have builders, carpenters making structures. And you start to develop a finance industry as well. People who, merchants, tend to amass a lot of capital, and then one of the ways they can make money is by lending it to others. And they assess the risk, they invest accordingly, and some merchants sort of have a banking operation as part of their business, and some just end up leaving trade and becoming bankers. So you have all of these things that start to develop in the city. And so what you start to see is these very sort of richly elaborated social structures where you have a lot of depth in the types of work that are being performed and the types of education and skills that are developing in the city. And that is characteristic of a sort of successful urban area, is that there is a lot of diversity. And here I mean not racial and ethnic diversity, but a diversity of skill sets. So different perspectives on the same problem. And this is one of the things that makes cities very interesting places, is that you have people pursuing very different crafts and very different forms of life within a city. If you think about the flat hierarchy that's pictured here on the right, that is going to be more typical of a rural area. So you're going to have mostly everyone involved in farming. You're going to have a few people involved in something like goods and services for those farmers. But generally, you're not going to have a wide diversity of different social roles. You're going to have a relatively homogeneous society in terms of what people are doing professionally, right? So this is sort of one of the magic things about urbanism, is that you have people who have many different kinds of not only projects and goals in life, but understandings of what life is. Okay, thank you.